Thank you for joining us today for another session on sacred space, which we've entitled Presence, Person, Beauty. As part of our panel, we have Father Peter Newby from St. Mary's University, Eric Parry, Principal of Eric Parry Architects, who has been chairing all these sessions, Professor Christian Frost from London Met, and Professor Tracey Winton from Waterloo University. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Clemena Antonova from the Institute for Human Studies in Vienna. Clemena will be talking about sacred space as an icon, a new reading of Malevich's Black Square. So today we're really bringing together a panel from across the globe, with Tracey joining us from Canada and Eric in Tokyo. Would you like to say a few words, Eric?
Yes, of course. I just delighted, Clemena, for you joining us with this fascinating bridge between the idea of modernism, constructivism in Russia, which is seen as so much of an abstraction, but actually we all know underlying it is this very powerful sense of cultural rootedness. So just to say how exciting it is that you are joining us to make that evident in your own special way. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, thank you also for actually, in a way, pushing me to revisit some of the work I've been doing recently in the last year through the lens of the concept of sacred space, because, you know, some of the things I'll be talking about today are the result of actually thinking through topics that I've worked on for a long time. But at the same time, I wanted to see them through this perspective, which is in a way quite new for me, even though I've worked on space for years and years, but in a completely different way from, you know, what I'll try to do today. So thanks for the topic and making things interesting. You know, what I would like to do in this talk is basically to interrogate several widespread views about the religious aesthetic experience of icons, and to propose several theses in their place. So I'd like to test whether you actually think that they work and make sense to you. And the way I'm going to go about that is basically I'll outline these ideas, hypotheses, and I'll look at them through the perspective of Malevich's Black Square. The reason I chose this particular work is because I think that in a way it puts these questions into the open. And I think that this is just the beginning of a conversation that we all have to have if we want to understand the whole problem of religious art in a secular modernity. You know, the whole way of how modernism actually makes the concept of religious art problematic. So I'll just delve into my views, the widespread views, right away. So on the one hand, I think that it is very natural to think that what makes space sacred is not space itself. Space itself is a void. What makes it sacred is what you put in it. That looks like such an obvious idea. You know, for example, if you think in classical antiquity, the belief that, you know, that these rocks falling from the sky, thrown by the gods, and where they fall, the space becomes special because of the objective. If you think of relics, you know, what makes the place in a church, for example, sacred is that the relic of a saint has been put there. Of course, with icons, it is also very obvious that if you think of miraculous icons, or what is called, you know, icons not made by human hand. Like in Russian, it's "не рукотворная икона," which means literally that. Again, they're sacred objects. And when you put them in a certain place, in your house, in a church, you carry them in a procession in the street, you put them on top of a gate, like they did in Constantinople, they sanctify the space. So I would like to suggest that we think about the relationship between space and the object that it holds in a completely different way. Sort of we turn it upside down. So let's think about space as space itself is sacred, and the space sanctifies the object that is put inside the space. And I think that this is going to make the whole way of thinking about an icon and the viewing experience of an icon very, very different. Now, I think that someone who has been doing very interesting work, not exactly on this particular topic, but on the more general topic of sacred space and how it can be understood to function in an array of different ways, is actually the contemporary Byzantinist scholar, Alexei Lidov, who is quite a close friend of mine. He came up with the concept of hierotopy, which means literally sacred space. So I think he's been doing quite interesting research on that, and there have been various other scholars that have engaged with the concept of hierotopy. And in a way, what I'm doing today is one possible way of looking at this. So this is my first hypothesis. The second view I would like to think through is actually the very definition of an icon. Now, everybody knows that, art historians, theologians, religious scholars can never agree on what exactly constitutes an icon. But I think that if there's any consensus about it, without going into any sort of very complex definitions and so on, probably the agreement of most people would come down to an icon is an image that you can pray to, and it is a helpmate in the process of prayer. I think that there's probably a general consensus about that, no matter what else we think of icons. Now, this understanding of the icon, which is quite simple, is connected to an idea which is quite complicated, which is the whole notion of presence. And a concept that a lot of theology has looked at, a lot of philosophy has, analyzed and so on. Now, in very simple terms, this basically means that when you stand before an icon of Christ, you believe that Christ himself is in some way present in his image. Now, in some way is, in a sense, the really important thing here, because a lot of the Byzantine theology of the image that was developed in the context of the iconoclastic controversy in the 8th and the 9th century was actually taken up with defining the presence in the image, the presence of Christ, as this is, of course, the most important image in Christianity, the presence of Christ in his image. And this, of course, has implications of how you think of icons presenting the saints, the Mother of God, and so on and so forth. So the idea that you believe that when you pray before an icon, you're not talking to yourself, but you're actually talking to someone who is in the icon. The icon is a container, in a way, of the presence of the being that you're praying to, is obviously a fundamental significance to a believer. And this is why you sort of understand why, iconoclasm in the Christian context was often so violent, and the debates about icons were so ferocious, and people were getting killed and sacrificed their lives, because it's not a question about art, it is a question about the essence of Christian belief. Now, I think that, again, I don't want to go into details here, but I think something which is rather important to mention, that the theology of the image was developed in the context of the iconoclastic controversy. I'll call that the first stage of this theology. The second stage is something that I see as happening, which is, I think, quite important, even though usually people don't pay much attention to this moment in the development of this theory, is actually the beginning of the 20th century among Russian religious philosophers. And I think that they have two sources for their understanding of presence in the image. One is a bit more obvious one, Byzantine theology, but I think that they engage not so much with the theologians that were part of the iconoclastic controversy. So John of Damascus, Theodore the Studite, and people like that. I think the really important person here, the really important figure, is actually Saint Gregory Palamas in the 14th century and his theory of energies. Now, Gregory Palamas wasn't much interested in icons, but at the beginning of the 20th century, Russian religious philosophers borrowed his theory of energies and applied it to the icon in order to explain the nature of presence in the icon. So this is one source. The other source, which is somewhat unexpected, is actually, I think, in my opinion, is a romantic theory of the symbol, and the distinction that the romantics drew between symbol and allegory. The symbol is something that holds the presence, the connection, an ontological connection with the symbolized, unlike the allegory, where you have a sign that is quite disconnected with what it represents. So I don't want to go into any details here, but the whole point is that there's quite a long tradition, which in my view develops in two important stages. In Byzantine times and the beginning of the 20th century in Russia, that formulates the parameters of this whole understanding of the presence of what is represented in the image. Now, I think in a way, what all of this leads to is basically the understanding that if you're praying before an icon of Christ or of a saint, and if he's in some way there, the being, he or she is some way there, it means that by definition, you expect to have the figure, especially the face, of the being that you're praying to. So therefore, the whole idea about praying to an image that is completely and utterly non-representational is actually quite an interesting and obvious question. Can you pray to a black square? Can you pray to an empty space? So this is one of the questions I'll be looking at here. And I'm coming to my third idea, which is sort of connected to what I just said. The whole theology of the image thinks of icons as being so important and central to Christian belief because they become witnesses of the incarnation. So the whole doctrine of the incarnation, of Christ, is in a way, the evidence for it on one level is the icon. The reason that you can represent Christ in his icon is that Christ took a human form. People saw him. He had followers. So in a way, to say that you have painted Christ is something that is quite literally true. So in this sense, I think that it is important to think on the one hand of, let me put it in a different way, to think of the Christian theology of the image as based on a paradox. So there are two different things that you believe simultaneously. On the one hand, just like in Judaism, just like in Islam, it is impossible to represent God. God is spirit. He's absolutely transcendent to our world, so you cannot depict him. At the same time, and this is something specific to Christianity, you can represent God because God took human form in Christ. So this is what makes the whole theology of the icon and the icon itself possible. So my whole point here is that this way of thinking about the icon as a container of presence implies all of these ideas, and it implies thinking of the icon as a witness to the doctrine of the incarnation. Now, this is the general, quite widespread view, and my hypothesis would be that we think that it is, of course, possible to understand many icons along these lines. But I would also like to think of a certain group of images as icons in a completely different way. Not in terms of the image being a witness to the incarnation, but the image being a witness to a visualization of another doctrine, which is the doctrine of deification of theosis, and in simple words, the unity between man and God. If you think of what is the meaning of human life in Christianity, it is for human beings to take advantage of the gift of God, which is given to everyone as a possibility, that you develop spiritually, and at one point, you actually become one with God. So if you think of certain images as visualization of this particular idea, then the whole definition of the icon becomes different, obviously. But then I think that the whole nature of the experience, which I think is a religious aesthetical experience, not one or the other, it is both together. It's a complex religious aesthetical experience of the icon, becomes very different. If you think of an icon as an image that you pray to, someone is praying to someone, you think of a subject and an object. If you think of an icon as a visualization of the unity between man and God, you don't have an opposition between subject and object. There's no one praying to anyone. So, the very way you think of the whole experience and the very way you think of the icon is quite different. Now, these large theoretical questions, I think, in a way, to my mind, they're really brought forth in a very interesting and utterly original way by Malevich in The Black Square. And this is why I'd like to think through all of the, the three theoretical points I made here through this painting. So let me show you. So this is The Black Square, which is a painting that Kazimir Malevich did in 1915. And here you can see this painting in an exhibition at the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow a few years ago. Just a few words about Malevich. I imagine that he's familiar to most people, but just very shortly, he basically came from a Polish family in Ukraine. This was the time of the Russian Empire, so he had a very typical background for someone who grew up in an empire. So his native languages were Ukrainian and Polish, as well as Russian. And he did spend his childhood and early youth in Ukraine. And after that, he moved to what was at the time Petrograd, Moscow, and so on. So this work is from before the revolution, 1915. And it was presented in the following way. So if you look at the first image that you see here, the black and white photograph, this is one of the two remaining photographs from this exhibition in 1915. The exhibition was called The Last Futurist Exhibition 0.10. So if you look at it, you will see that basically all of these are paintings by Malevich. He participated in this exhibition with 39 works. And you see the black square as placed in this sort of corner position. This is very important for the purpose of my talk. Now, if you look at the image next to this one, this is an exhibition of Malevich's works at the Tate Modern Gallery in London in 2014. And as you see, what they have obviously done there, this is why I put the two photographs together, was that they tried to reconstruct the original installation of the show. They didn't quite get all the paintings, but I think that the main idea is that you have the so-called suprematist works by Malevich, organized around the black square, which is in the center, in the corner position, a bit above high level. So, in other words, what my whole argument in this talk is based on is that you have to think of the black square in terms of the space where it was meant to be put. In other words, if you have a presentation as what you saw in the first painting, my whole argument, I'm afraid, collapses because you're looking at an icon at the eye level on a flat wall. But this is not how it was exhibited. So it is very important to do what I think they did very rightly in the Tate Modern, that the icon is meant to be seen within context, in sacred space, in the core. Now, why is this important? Because in 1915, anyone who went to see this exhibition would have been aware of something which is very common practice in Russian Orthodox Christianity, that in every house, people would have what is called krasny ugol, or the red or the beautiful corner, where you put all the most important icons, So the corner position by itself, within this context, within this religious tradition, the corner position holds a special place. This is holy space. So what you put in the corner, in a way, is sanctified by the space itself. And you see, this is my argument, that there's nothing particularly extraordinary, special, holy about painting a black square. If you put a black square on a wall, there's nothing very special about that. There's a long history of painting black squares. There is a book that Andrew Spira, someone who I think is actually a very interesting writer for all those who are interested in icons, but especially icons in their connection to avant-garde art. He's done some very interesting work there. So his last book, which came out last year, is about the precursors of Malevich's black painting. So he looks at many, many quite interesting examples throughout the history of art of representations of black squares. Now, some of these representations may have some sort of mystical or religious meaning. A lot of them even don't pretend to. And I'm going to show you just a few of those. So, as you see, what I'm trying to say here is that a black square on its own doesn't necessarily imply that there's anything special or certainly religiously significant about this image. The moment you put the black square in a corner, it acquires an important religious significance that makes a lot of sense within Russian Orthodox Christianity. And I think that it is in this sense interesting to see that this way of thinking about the image was the way, this is how it was perceived at the time. Critics of Malevich keep referring to his work as an icon. Malevich himself, trying to defend himself, refers to his work as an icon. And what makes it an icon is the space. So let me read to you some of the reactions at the time. So Alexander Benoit, who was one of the most prominent art critics at the beginning of the 20th century in Russia, was, well, frankly, horrified when he saw Malevich's work. And he says, what we have here is the new icon of the square. And for him, this new image signified that everything holy and sacred that we possess, everything we love, and which was our reason for living, has disappeared. And then there was Malevich's provocative reaction. Malevich was quite an aggressive person as such, and very direct. So then there was his reaction. And again, the interesting thing is that again, he refers to his painting as an icon. I have only a single bare and frameless icon of our times, but my happiness in not being like you will give me the strength to go further and further into the empty wilderness, for it is only there that transformation can take place. So in other words, why do all these people, the artist himself, his critics, people who were quite fascinated and thought that this was a great idea and so on, why did so many people in this circle refer to this painting as an icon? And I think this is the reason, because it was intentionally placed in the hall. So you have an example, to go back to what was my first point that I outlined to you. You have an example of space being sacred, and you put an object in it, and it actually, the space itself confers holiness to the object, rather than the way we usually think about the relationship between space and the object that it holds. So I'd like to show you something else. You know, this is a representation, again, as you can see, of a black square, which was brought to my attention by my PhD supervisor, Martin Kemp, the well-known Leonardo specialist. And it's basically from a work by Robert Flood, which was published in 1670, so the beginning of the 17th century. And basically what it is supposed to represent is the universe before the creation. So again, you have a black square looking very much like Malevich's black square. And let me show you another example, which is actually from Andrew Spira's book. And the reason I chose it is that it is obviously a way of, using squares that makes no metaphysical, religious, mystical claims or anything like that. And there's also a Viennese connection, and I'm in Vienna. I very often pass by this building. So this is actually a caricature from a Viennese newspaper. And the caricature was published in 1911. And the title is Los von dem Architektur. Los means away from architecture. And there is a play of words here, because los is away, but also the caricature is a caricature of Adolf Loos, the famous architect. And basically, what the text under the caricature says, brooding about art, the most modern man, they're making here fun of Adolf Loos, claiming to be so fashionable and modern and, going ahead, being part of the avant-garde. So the most modern art walks through the streets. Suddenly, he stops transfixed. He has found that for which he has searched for so long. And basically, as you see, they're showing a man who's staring at a sewer. And, the sewer, once it's open, or what's called a manhole, once it is open, you see a black hole and then the lid. And next to it, actually, if you look at the magazine, this is on the next page, you see a drawing of the very famous Loos house in Vienna. So basically, the idea is that Adolf Loos's idea for this building came from a sewer. And this is how the building looks. You might have seen it in Vienna. By the way, there's quite a funny story about how when Adolf Loos put up this building, as it's actually just across from the main entrance to the royal palace in Vienna, Franz Joseph, the emperor at the time, started he would draw his curtains because he found this building so ugly he couldn't even look at it, So in other words, what I'm trying to bring to attention here is that there is a long history of painting black squares. What makes Malevich's work so, in a way, it was perceived as quite scandalous and shocking, and I think it was meant to shock, was actually the position in which it was put and the space where it was put. So I'd like to mention something else, something that, is an idea that I think is usually interpreted in a very fragmentary way. Malevich famously spoke about his art as the zero of form, and people often understand that in terms of describing his paintings, which were very radically abstract, like his suprematist works, like, for example, the Black Square. But I think that if you look carefully at his texts, at which he talks about the zero of form, I think he also means something different on top of that. So basically, in 1920, he published a short essay, which was called God is Not Carved Down. And he talks there about, let me just quote directly from this text. He says there, I have transformed myself into the zero of form. So you see something that I think is not very often noticed. The zero of form is not just about the image at the painting and the object. The zero of form is about yourself, the viewer, and the artist himself. And in other words, the zero of form refers to this quote I read to you before. It refers to the transformation that has taken place in the artist and potentially in the viewer. So let me read to you another quote by Malevich. So he talks there about how the end of a human being is to act, and this is a quote, no longer as a man, but as God, for he will incarnate himself in God and become perfection. How do you achieve that? According to Malevich, by freeing yourself from the figurative world of objects via, in Russian, it's bespredmetnost, which literally means objectlessness. And a human being will become then, and that's again a quote, weightless will enter God. Now, this may sound very abstract, but for anyone who is versed in Orthodox theology, it sounds very familiar, because this is another way of describing the unity of man in God, which the doctrine, the theological doctrine of theosis or deification is about. And this is very much the language that theologians are using. I'm not making here a claim that Malevich read these theologians. I'm just saying that they're describing a very similar phenomenon, not someone looking at something or at someone, but what happens at the moment of unity between man and God. The moment of unity is when man becomes God, becomes one with God. And I think that if you think of the black square along these lines, the very definition of the icon becomes different, and the nature of the experience of a believer before an image of that sort will have to be seen along quite different lines. So this is more or less what I wanted to share with you today. And if you have any questions and comments, I'd like to have, it would be very useful for me to actually have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for actually, just lifting the lid in a way, to so much that's familiar and casting it into an entirely new perspective culturally. And actually, it's something that has been a question for me from my familiarity through thinkers like Dalibor Vesely, who alluded to this many times. So thanks so much. Let's open the floor. And I see Jose has his hand up, so perhaps we can start there.
Very well. Thank you, Clemena, so much for your presentation. It's a work in progress. I can see from the way you put it. You opened the floor really to questions and to a reflection. There are a number of things I'd like to ask, but I just like to say that it's very stimulating to see the Malevich as a black square, in fact, and then in contrast with Flood's depiction of the prime matter or the hele, and that whole discussion. And I think one of the points of contact which you touched upon really has to do with the zero of form, because that's precisely what Flood that's how he described the prime matter. The prime matter of the universe is without form. It's informal. It doesn't sound very well in English, but in Latin that would be informal. And so there is a connection there. Malevich may have never been aware of that. That's true, but there is a connection in that concept. In a sense, they were both striving for the same absence. Not for the same thing, but for the same absence. But there is something I would like to ask, a very simple question, really. And you started with that. Can you pray to a black square? Can you pray to an empty space? Why is it that some images invite us to prayer and others don't? And by extension, the same question could be asked from music, from painting, sculpture, architecture. Of course, I don't just mean, what makes an icon, and I don't just mean the blessing of an object or the rite of consecration of a church, but the visual quality of the space of the object, which is to say, in its broadest sense, the spatial quality of the object. I suppose in the office we would go about it intuitively, but I'd be very interested to know what you think.
Yeah, I think, well, for a long time I thought that the very definition of an icon, in terms of, its Christian meaning, implies having the face of someone that you pray to, for the reasons I explained. At the same time, I think that, you see these radically abstract images, like, for example, the black square, that are being perceived, described by people as producing that sort of experience, like they're standing before an icon. And I think that this is something that is necessary for people to think through. Now, I'd like to mention something which I think it's an interesting phenomenon, which I haven't quite worked through, but I think it does make points of contact with the way that the black square works. There was, at least at the beginning of the 20th century, a religious sect in Russia that was called Dirniki. Dirniki means whole worshippers. And basically what these people were doing, they were a religious sect. There were some sort of, people who were less educated, but there were also quite well-educated people who were members of the sect. And they would pray to a hole in the wall. It is such a fundamentally different experience from the experience of most Eastern Orthodox Christians who actually need a face to pray to, that it is something that sort of makes you think, about the very possibilities that, abstraction in art itself has. Because whether you're praying to a black hole or a black square, the whole point is that you don't have the face of anyone to pray to. And I think it is something that is interesting to think through. And I think that, most of my work over the years has been on medieval art. And recently I've been thinking more and more of how, if you want to really tackle the problem of the icon, you have to take on board modernist, contemporary, modern, avant-garde religious art. Because a lot of the issues there that maybe in some way present in medieval icons are brought to an extreme, like, for example, with the black square. So, but as you say, and as I told you, this is still very much, I'm sort of presenting to you some of the ideas I've been working with and questions I've been struggling with, which I think are, I think they're not just interesting, I think they're important on several levels. For the experience of the icon, you have to, in a way, tackle these questions.
I'm looking for another hand, and I may not have all the hands. But I wanted myself about this idea of the corner and the square as being like a window, and having something to do with, as a bridge with flood, clearly, this idea of a spatial infinity to which it becomes very plausible to draw yourself in to a contemplative kind of prayer, obviously. So it's like a focal point in this room, whereas on the wall, it resides. This is somehow like a lens, and something very beautiful about that. It's a comment, and I see that Peter has a question, most importantly.
Peter, we can't hear you.
Thank you for your talk, firstly. I'd like to mention about your questioning three presuppositions that are widespread views, as you called them. The first one was about a sacred space that contains the artwork, and whereby you say the artwork creates a sacred space. It's something, an object sort of creates a sacred space. I would see that quite a lot in the modern in church architecture I'm studying of the 1920s. the fact is that the ritual creates the setting, not the setting the ritual. And I think that I can see an arranging parallel here, that that when the sort of the architects of the ressourcement, returning to the sources of Christian inspiration in the early centuries, saw their buildings as this, as it were, the ritual creates the setting, and not the other way around. So quite radically different to sort of Baroque and Renaissance or Victorian Gothic revival church architecture. So thank you very much. I thought there's a lot to go away and think about, but these reversals of sort of common preconceptions, I think, are very sort of very helpful for what I'm studying as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I say something to that before I forget? You know, I was trying to think of another case. It may be in a different religious tradition, of where we can think about space in a similar way, like space being sacred itself, and then objects, and then space confers holiness on the objects that it holds. And you know, what came to my mind is actually, if you think about Islamic architecture, you know, you go into a mosque and it is the direction to Mecca, which is the sacred space. So long as you know where's the direction to Mecca, even if you don't put anything there, the space itself is sacred. And then you have the mihrab, which is this sort of highly ornamented part of the mosque that indicates the space, but it is the space itself, which on its own is sacred. So I'm sure that this exists in other traditions as well, but I still think that initially our first almost instinctive reaction of thinking about the relationship between space and the object that it holds is that space is a void. What makes it sacred is what you put in. Or, like you say, the ritual that takes place in it. So I think that, you know, you very rarely think about it in the opposite way. Like you start with holiness in the space itself, and then everything else being sanctified by the space.
Thank you. Tracey, you're muted, but I know you've got a question. Thank you.
And thank you, Clemena. Very provocative to think about this in such a comprehensive way. So I'm thinking just a one comment about space. I'm thinking about how very often the site of a sacred space precedes any marker or specific religious attachment to it. In fact, which is why we often find that any given site has carried different religious buildings over time. Sometimes it's even just a mountain or a tree, which is really interesting. But I really like the way that you made the connection between the kind of archaic qualities of an icon and the modernity of Black Square. And I'm thinking, you know, if we go back through Flood, we can really see that Black Square as having a trans-temporal quality, which I think we can also maybe say eternal, but I don't want to kind of presume here that it's all of those things at once. It's the archaic prima materia before the creation, which Flood is, of course, presenting us, but which, of course, I think Malevich is capable of thinking about. And I don't have a lot of experience looking critically at Orthodox art, but thinking about the Black Square as something which is the receiver of our gaze, and your collapsing of the subject and object, I'm wondering whether there's a kind of active vision that looks at the prima materia and is somehow cosmogonic. I just have that feeling that there is something that's maybe cued by the placement in the corner, defamiliarizing us so that we don't just read it as art. It problematizes it. And I think at some level, we're also co-creating what we're seeing there. So I don't know if that's really a question, just to kind of comment on
But
what I'm
this
getting.
actually makes, I think that this makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that in a way, this was Malevich's purpose in what he did. You know, I don't think that he was very good at actually explaining well. He wasn't a very, very well-read or highly intellectual person. So I think that a lot of things are there, like in the mind of someone who is super talented, but cannot really always express himself in words as well as he does in images. And I think that, you know, you see here and there how he sees the black square as actually questioning, exactly as you said, the very function of art as such. So it is not just about art. Like, for example, let me read to you completely at random something. So he says of himself, I knifed down art, put its body in a coffin, and sealed it with the black square. So you see that the very idea that he's creating this image, which is going to disturb our very notion of art, was there, and it was part of the intention. And I think that this is one of the reasons why people at the time were so disturbed, but also, and it is very interesting for me, that people are still being very disturbed and use highly emotive language to describe the extreme reactions to the black square. Like, you know, for example, I don't know if you came across this article in the New Yorker. There was an article about Malevich's black square in 2015. Yeah. And basically, just let me read to you how this was described. Someone who was apparently very, very upset by this painting, that this is a sinister canvas, a black hole in a sacred spot, which reduces everything to the zero of form, a square, the point after which, because of which, and beyond which nothing exists and nothing can exist. So you see someone who is very, very upset, you know, quite recently writing about Malevich's work in such a way. And then you have reactions on the other side, like, for example, you know, in Andrew Spearer's book, you know, almost his first sentence is that the black square is the most interesting and beautiful painting ever made. And just as what you said, he says that what is interesting about it is that it asks the question, what is art? But, you know, I think that it is interesting to see how, on the one hand, someone could see it as the most beautiful painting. Now, obviously, the whole concept of beauty here is not sort of standard pretty and things like that. And on the other hand, you can have people still getting so upset about it.
Amazing. Yeah.
Thank you. Indeed. Yeah. Thanks. Christian, please. You're muted, Christian.
Okay, sorry, I had my microphone in the wrong position. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. I often write about bits of the medieval as well. For me, I think there was a couple of things I'd like to point out, and then a question at the end. One of the things is, it seems to me you're arguing that to a certain extent the icon is enacted, or the enactment of the icon. There's a participation in it, and it's only through that participation that it gains its authentic presence, if you like. It's not something as an object, it needs that interaction. But equally, the idea of the image of Christ seems to me also, you mentioned the iconoclastic aspect of it, but I think also a reference to the Arian controversy, the monophysite nature of Christ, and how that, for example, in the two baptistries in Ravenna, resulted in very different representations of Christ and the saints, with the Arian one beautifully making itself known as a body by having the belly button of Christ right in the center of the circle, which is really a beautiful moment, just in terms of a very simple representation of that bodily, that earthly function of Christ in Arian ideas. But I think that would, for me, have helped begin to understand a little bit more, because obviously there's the Orthodox and the iconoclastic, but the Arianism interestingly sits somewhere sort of in between that, and maybe help clarify some of those ideas of representation. Because in the end, what I came to, and this is in a sense moving towards my question, is I think there is a difference between the icon and Malevich's black square. And for me, it's the difference between being and existence. Insofar as you have, I'll give you as a simple example. When Julian Palazzma talks about experience in architecture, he starts off with one or two very beautiful sentences that talk about or infer being. I can infer being from those situations, but thereafter he uses the term existence. And I think there is a difference between looking at the horizon of being, either as something that is unknown or something that is the end. And for me, I think Malevich is referring, albeit to that moment, in terms of existence rather than being. I suppose that's a little bit of a provocation for you, but nevertheless, I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'll be able to. I think that there are actually several sort of questions, some more obvious, some less obvious. I don't know if I'll be able to reply to all of them, but I think that what you say about being and existence is something which I think is actually quite useful in this context. And I'm trying to think about it in theological terms. That is, if you have the moment of theosis, the moment at which there is no subject and object, the whole opposition has collapsed in a unity. Can you describe what happens after that, at the moment of unity? Can you describe that as existence? I think probably actually the way you use the two terms, I would actually think that it's probably being is a bit more abstract here. So I think I would think of it more as being rather than existence. I don't know. Would you agree with that?
Well, for me, I think it's just the relationship between the idea of the limit or the limits. And I think for me, the existence does not necessarily recognize the divine. What it recognizes is an infinite possibility, but the absence of knowledge. What being asks for is not necessarily a doctrinal description of what is beyond, but nevertheless it places itself within that world. There is a moment in which you can accept what you don't know doesn't necessarily mean, and Plato talks about this in the death of Socrates, and there's some really beautiful moments in literature which I'm sure you're aware of. So for me, there is a difference, and it's interesting, I think, because I think they both refer to this horizon, and I think we probably all five of us come up with a different description of what that might mean. But for me, that is the difference, and whichever way around you choose to do it. For me, it's being in the icon and existence in Malevich, but they're both doing something similar, which is about dealing with the limits.
I think that it is also a bit intriguing to think that one of the ways in which in theological literature this moment of unity between human and divine is often described is through the language of unknowing. You have no subject and object in a way, like in the terms in which we spoke about, no one is praying to anyone, but you also go beyond knowledge for the same reason, because there's no one to know anyone. You exist in the unity. And, I think that, people like Dionysius the Areopagite are probably not very easy to understand. But I think that I sort of, I get a bit of a sense of why it was important for him to keep going back to this notion that what is happening is beyond vision. So vision helps you to get to the point beyond vision. If no subject, no object, there is no one looking at anyone, and beyond knowing. And I think that, I think that when we think of existence and being the way you're using the terms, I think this also goes into the whole way of thinking about it. But yeah.
Thank you.
I think that these theological ideas always sound a little bit, a bit confusing. But I think that, in a way, I think that what is one of the values of icons is that they visualize ideas which, if they remain on the conceptual level, they're so abstract, so difficult to understand. And then you have an icon that manages to visualize somehow way better than what words can do. And I think that, all these paradoxes in the theology of the icon and so on, in a way, are much easier to resolve on a purely visual level. Like, you look at a painting like that, and sort of, even if you can't describe all these ideas, they're sort of there, that helps you think it through.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think it was not just a thought, it certainly was a memorable seminar.